The people of ancient Mesopotamia held a very special belief about how the world began. They didn't think knowledge started with humans. They believed it was given to them. But by whom? It was 7 figures, remembered as teachers who appeared from the sea at the very beginning, when human life had no clear structure. So who were these beings? Where did they come from? And were they gods or something else? Welcome to the mysteries of mythology. The Apkallu. If you've heard of the Apkallu, especially if your first time was on YouTube or TikTok, then you're probably convinced that they were extraterrestrial astronauts, demons, or maybe even an ancient race of serpent slaves. And to be fair, I couldn't prove you wrong. But if you're a regular of the channel, then you'll know that I'll present what the most widely accepted information is, and you can make your own conclusions. The name Apkallu comes from Akkadian, the language used across much of ancient Mesopotamia, and it simply means wise ones or sages. I had a question when I was researching this, and it was, why do we use the Akkadian name when their mythology comes from the older Sumerian language? It's because while those earlier Sumerian texts describe figures like Adapa, considered one of the first Apkallu, in Akkadian sources they're grouped together under a single name. My secondary school history teacher would be so proud of me, questioning the research. I didn't listen in class, Mr. Ormerod, but look at me now. The Apkallu are closely tied to a god called Ea, known in early Sumerian tradition as Enki. He was the god associated with wisdom, creation, and with the fresh waters believed to exist beneath the earth. This hidden realm, known as Apsu, was thought to be the source of life, but also a source of knowledge. They weren't rulers, and they weren't worshipped like major gods. They acted as intermediaries between the divine world and the human one, passing knowledge from one to the other. A Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing in Greek centuries after the earlier Sumerian texts, describes one of these beings in very vivid detail. That being is called Oannes. According to his account, Oannes had the outer form of a fish, but beneath that was a human figure. During the day, he would come out of the water and teach people. When the day ended, he would return to the depths. The people believed that hidden in the depths of the sea, beneath the surface, was the source of all knowledge. What's also important about the Apkallu was the time that they existed. A key event would change everything. Mesopotamian tradition doesn't describe just one of these figures. There's a group of them. 7 sages known as the Apkallu who are placed at the very beginning of human history. Later texts list their names, though the exact forms vary slightly depending on the source. Each of these sages is connected to the earlier cities, especially Eridu, which was considered one of the first centers of civilization and the home of the god Ea. The sages appear one after another, each associated with an early ruler and the foundations of the first cities, but they all happen before a major dividing event, the flood. This division shows up in several Mesopotamian sources, where history is split into 2 parts. There is a time before the flood, when knowledge is closely tied to the divine, and a time after, when that connection becomes more distant. The Apkallu belong to that earlier age. They represent the period when knowledge was not something people discovered slowly. It was something that arrived fully formed, carried by figures who understood how the world was meant to function. But of the 7, there was one that was given more attention, not because he was more powerful, but because his story survives in detail. A story that doesn't just describe the beginning of civilization, but also explains one of the most basic limits of human life. And his name was Adapa. Adapa is often identified as one of the first of the 7 sages, linking him to a figure later described as Oannes. But unlike the others, his story survived in detail. We see it in texts found across the ancient Near East, including tablets from Amarna in Egypt and from the Assyrian city of Nineveh. This wasn't a small local story, it travelled. Adapa was described as a man from Eridu, the city most closely linked to Ea. He wasn't a god or an immortal, he was human. But he had something unusual. The texts say that Ea created Adapa and gave him wisdom. Adapa understood rituals, order, and how the world was meant to function. He also served as a priest of Ea in Eridu, maintaining the proper relationship between the human and the divine worlds. Then, something happened that changed everything. One day, while fishing, Adapa was caught in a storm. The south wind overturned his boat, and in his anger, he struck it and broke its power. The wind stopped and didn't blow again for 7 days. That act drew divine attention. The sky god Anu noticed, and Adapa was summoned to heaven to answer for what he had done. Before he went, Ea gave him a warning. He told Adapa that when he stood before Anu, he would meet the gatekeepers of heaven, Dumuzu and Gazida. Ea instructed him to show them respect, to win their favor. He also told him that when food and drink were offered, he must refuse them. Ea said it would be the food of the dead. Adapa obediently listened. When they reached heaven, the encounter did not unfold as expected. The gatekeepers received him favorably, and when he stood before Anu, he explained what had happened. Instead of punishing him, Anu was impressed. And then he offered Adapa something entirely different from what he was expecting: the food and water of life. He was offered immortality. This was a moment that defined the whole story, because Adapa followed Ea's instructions and turned the food down. Because of that decision, he lost his chance of immortality. This is how Mesopotamian tradition explained why humans did not live forever. Immortality had once been within reach, and it was lost. Adapa kept his wisdom. He understood the world in a way other humans did not. What he did not gain was eternal life. Humans could learn, they could receive knowledge, they could build and organize the world around them, but they did not become gods. And that raises a deeper question. If the Apkallu brought knowledge into the world, what kind of knowledge was it that it mattered so much? Mesopotamian texts don't describe Apkallu as inventors in the modern sense. Instead, they're remembered as teachers of order. According to these traditions, human life existed before the sages, but it lacked structure. There was no stable systems, no shared understanding of how society should function. What the Apkallu introduced was structure. Their role was tied to ritual practice, the building and maintenance of temples, and the establishment of systems that allowed people to live together in a stable and organized way. A city was not just a place where people lived. It was a place where humans and gods were brought into alignment. Rituals were part of maintaining that balance. So when later sources describe the Apkallu as teaching writing, law, agriculture, and temple building, they're not listing isolated skills. They're describing a connected system that allows civilization to function. But there is something else that stands out about them. If these figures were understood as wise humans and teachers of order, then why are they so often shown in such a strange and specific way? Why are they depicted in forms that do not look fully human at all? When we move from the text to art, the Apkallu become easier to recognize. They appear across Mesopotamia in reliefs, carvings, and small ritual figures, especially during the Neo-Assyrian period. Many are shown as human figures wearing the skin of a fish. The fish's head sits above their own, and its body falls down their back like a cloak. This isn't meant to show a creature that is half fish and half human. It's something more deliberate. But this imagery is thought to be one of the first concepts of mermaids as covered in my mermaid video. The outer layer connects them to the fresh waters of the Apsu associated with Ea, understood as the source of life and hidden knowledge. The fish cloak shows where the wisdom comes from. Once that connection is clear, how they look makes more sense. Not all Apkallu look the same. In Assyrian art, some figures appear with wings, others have bird-like features. Some are fully human in form but carry specific objects. In many cases, small figures of the Apkallu were placed beneath floors or within the structure of buildings. This suggests they were part of a protective practice, and that leads to the next step in their story. By the time we reach the Neo-Assyrian period, the role of the Apkallu is clearly developed. They're no longer described as figures from a distant early age. Instead, they appear as part of the active religious practice, especially in royal settings. We see them in palaces of kings such as Ashurnasirpal II and Sargon II. They're carved into walls and placed at key points in the buildings. In these scenes, the Apkallu often hold two objects. In one hand, a small bucket, in the other, a cone-shaped item. They're shown making repeated gestures as if they're applying or sprinkling something. The exact details are still debated, but the purpose is clear enough. They're trying to maintain order. But this change is part of a larger pattern, a division between two different worlds, one before the flood and one after it. Mesopotamian tradition divides its own past into two clear periods. There is a time before the flood and the time after it. The idea appears in several texts, including the Sumerian king list, which describes early rulers who lived before the Great Flood and changed the world. But after the flood, things change. The tradition does not suggest that knowledge disappears. Cities continue to grow, writing develops further, systems become more complex. What changes is the source. Instead of divine sages, we begin to see human scholars, priests and scribes. The figures preserve knowledge, organize it and pass it on, but they're no longer described as being sent directly by a god. Some later texts make this connection very clear. They present the human scholars as inheritors of the earlier tradition. And this may have been a way to reinforce what the priests would preach. Their teachings were originally shared by beings who directly spoke to a god. But recently, there's been a lot of claims that the Apkallu came from beyond the stars, and the knowledge of humanity advanced overnight. So what does the evidence actually show? When we step back from the stories and look at the evidence, the picture becomes clearer. We're not relying on a single source. The Apkallu appears across texts, in art, and alongside the archaeological record of Mesopotamian civilization itself. But the archaeological records tell a different kind of story. It shows how cities actually developed over time. Places like Eridu grew gradually. Writing did not appear fully formed, it developed step by step. Systems became more organized over long periods, not all at once. There's no clear evidence of advanced knowledge appearing suddenly from an unknown source. What I think it shows is something more incredible and something deeper. They reflect how Mesopotamians, just regular humans, understood knowledge. So instead of asking what the Apkallu were or where they were from, a different question becomes more useful. What did they represent to the people who told the stories? The Apkallu are not just figures from an old story. They don't tell us how civilization began in a scientific sense. What they show us is how one of the earliest civilizations understood its own beginnings. In Mesopotamia, knowledge was not seen as something ordinary. It was tied to order, to the gods, and to the structure of the world itself. The Apkallu sits at the center of that idea. They appear as the first teachers, then protectors, and later as part of a tradition that continues through human scholars. So what do you think of the Apkallu? Do you think they were mermaids, ancient aliens, or something else?